Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The push to build large-scale data centers to drive the nation's appetite for AI and other technological advancements is a potential source for economic development for tribes. But the significant energy and water demands they present sparks considerable resistance from local citizens. Mother Jones looks at the increasingly organized resistance to data centers on tribal lands in the face of major incentives from the federal government. We'll hear more after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Jill Freitas. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made a stop in the Phoenix Metro to visit the Gia River Indian community last week. As KJZZ's Gabriel Piataracio reports, Kennedy touted tribal health accomplishments a year into President Trump's second term.
Kennedy briefly took the stage at Wild Horse Pass during the annual Tribal Self-Governance Conference.
We're going to make Indian country healthy again. Thank you all very, very much.
In his speech, Kennedy talked about making progress on key issues like food sovereignty, chronic disease, and federal dietary guidelines. He, along with the USDA, literally flipped the food pyramid upside down, tackling staffing shortages and aging infrastructure across the entire Indian Health Service was another topic. Yet the now-defunct DOJ terminated a dozen leases for IHS facilities. This decision was seen as a cost-savings measure to shore up funds tied into federal office space. And according to data from Stanford's Big Local News, the U.S. also canceled 121 IHS contracts totaling over $8 million last year. For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrazio.
The federal government is encouraging tribes to partner with data centers. That could mean leasing land or, as the Mountain West News Bureau's Hannah Merzbach reports, selling power.
At a U.S. Department of Energy webinar, Ken Ahman with Colusa Indian Energy said that's where the big bucks come in.
Potentially billions of dollars into the coffers of tribes.
His company provides energy infrastructure to data centers on tribal land. He says these partnerships can be good for tribes that have land and resources to power big projects, like the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. Paul Beemore is the chair of the tribe's utility board.
Tribes that are casino dependent really need to look at other ways to build their economies. And I think that data centers is one of those opportunities.
Though Beemore says people may be wary about how this will impact the environment. Other tribes have expressed concerns about data centers draining precious water supplies. For National Native News, I'm Hannah Merzbach.
The Native Youth Olympics begin this week in Anchorage. The games kick off Thursday, April 16th at the Alaska Airlines Center, bringing together hundreds of student athletes from across the state. Now in its 54th year, the Native Youth Olympics celebrate traditional Alaska Native games rooted in survival skills, strength, and endurance. Events include the 1-foot high kick, seal hop, and wrist carry, all designed to test both physical ability and mental toughness. Ann Lawrence is from Point Hope and a cultural advisor for the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. She says watching the children reunite every year brings her joy.
My favorite thing is I love watching the kids participate. You see the friendship that has grown over the years. And, some of the ones that have started out as freshmen are graduating from high school, and they're very involved, and it just warms my heart that these kids know that what they are doing here is something that they can share with their future relatives, maybe as they become parents, grandparents. I think it's so important.
The games run Thursday through Saturday and are free and open to the public. I'm Jill Freitas.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tribal Development Partners believe strong infrastructure strengthens tribal sovereignty. Through the 105L lease program, TDP helps align federal funding systems with long-term tribal priorities. More at tribaldevpartners.com. Proud to support this show.
Hear that? Tribal college faculty do so much, one can't say it all here. Nothing but respect. Visit mostthoroughdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The Seminole Nation of Oklahoma is one of the first tribes to pass a moratorium against the construction of hyperscale data centers. The nearby Muscogee Nation also turned down an opportunity to build a data center after their tribal citizens spoke out in force against the plan. Large tech companies are increasing pressure to build hyperscale data centers to house processing power for data storage and generative AI, while promising economic boosts for communities and tribes willing to partner. The federal government is providing incentives for tribes to get involved in this latest wave of the tech boom. It is part of the Trump administration's push to unleash American technological power. But such facilities typically require a lot of energy and water. Native environmentalists warn data center companies are only looking to take advantage of tribe sovereignty and resources. Are there plans for data center projects in or near your tribal community? Join our conversation today. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's now meet today's guests. Joining us first from Shawnee, Oklahoma is Ashley Litka. She is the co-director of the Sovereignty and Self-Determination Department for Honor the Earth. She is absentee Shawnee and Oglala Lakota. Ashley, hello. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Hi. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Joining us from Tulsa, Oklahoma is Jordan Harmon. She's a policy specialist for the Indigenous Environmental Network, and she is a citizen of the Muscogee Nation. Jordan, hello to you too, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Mado, for having me.
Joining us from Brooklyn, New York is Cheyenne McNeil. She's an editorial fellow at Mother Jones and a member of the Kohari tribe. Cheyenne, hello. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Hey, happy to be here.
And joining us from Flagstaff, Arizona is Dr. Karen Jarrett Snyder. She is a professor of applied indigenous studies at Northern Arizona University, and she is Choctaw. Karen, good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Ashley, I'd like to begin with you because Honor the Earth tracks data centers on and near tribal lands. How many tribes currently have data centers and how big are they?
Yeah, so right now we're currently tracking, I would say, over a dozen. You can find more on our website, of course. And we really think it's important to distinguish between the different sort of data centers because we acknowledge that data centers have been here for quite a long time. What we're talking about are the hyperscale data centers that require hundreds of acres of land in order to operate. So those are the ones that we're keenly interested in, particularly the ones that are located on tribal lands or on or near the jurisdiction of tribal nations. And so that brings us to Oklahoma. And right now we are dealing with 4 data centers, and we've seen a few more pop on the horizon.
Now, you used the figure earlier about a dozen. Are those hyperscale data centers, or might those be smaller ones included in that number?
No, these are all hyperscale data centers.
Okay, gotcha. Now, smaller data centers, I think, would be like the one we have in our studio for Native America Calling. We've got servers and we've got equipment. We've got a cooling room to keep it all the right temperature. What about tribes and businesses also? Would they have similar types of operations that we would describe or define as data centers?
Yeah, a lot of these tribes, many of them do have their own data centers, and like you said, they can be as small as a closet. It really depends on the needs of the tribal nation, and that's one of the things that we're talking to different tribal nations who have been approached by these hyperscale data center developers and companies. Is really doing an assessment of what your actual technological needs are, and determine whether or not the scale of that is commiserate with the need. And so we're often finding, and even with conversations with these large tribes like Cherokee Nation, for example, finding out that, maybe they don't actually need a hyperscale data center. Maybe it's something smaller, more localized, and maybe with, this conversation around sovereignty, and working with other tribes, maybe it's something that, a larger tribe like the Cherokee Nation could house on their land, and they could work in concert with smaller tribes who don't have access to those resources. And so that's, definitely some of the conversation that we're having at Honor the Earth.
Okay. And Ashley, what is it about tribal lands that make them attractive to these large tech companies that are interested in building these hyperscale data centers? What do we have to offer in Indian country?
Yeah, well, tribal nations have a lot to offer for developers who are looking for vast amounts of land. A lot of our tribes, especially our Plains nations and tribes in Oklahoma, have vast stretches of land on our jurisdiction, and a lot of that is rural, so it's undeveloped. And then we also have access to resources. Some of us are water rich, not necessarily here in Oklahoma, but other places do have access to water, whether that be in South Dakota or Montana. And we also have tribal sovereignty, which in some ways can be used to move around some of the regulations or restrictions that are coming from the state or from even the federal level, even though we have seen a lot of those federal regulations rolled back, the gutting of NEPA, and a push for hyperscale data centers from the administration. So yeah, we definitely have the land, we have the resources, and we have the sovereignty.
And what are the risks then that could ultimately be posed to a tribal community considering a data center, a large-scale data center like what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I know some of the other guests will talk more about the environmental concerns, and obviously at Honor the Earth, that's first and foremost in our minds, but I think it's really important, and a lot of times this conversation is bifurcated into hyperscale data centers and generative AI. But at Honor the Earth, we think it's really critical that we bring the whole cycle together and show how this entire cycle of hyperscale data centers and generative AI harms Indigenous lands and communities, whether it be the mining of the so-called critical minerals that are required for the GPUs, all the way to actually building the hyperscale data centers and extracting the water. It's really important for people to understand that there are a lot of pieces of the puzzle. And one of the things that we emphasize over and over again is that the only benefit that we're seeing from these hyperscale data centers and this technology is the ability of the state and these companies to actually automate the monitoring of human beings by collecting and mining our data. And also alongside that, we've seen that with ICE, and we've seen that with the current war in Iran, that, it also leads to the expanding of repression and centralizing of power, which we think is a major threat to our tribal nations and our sovereignty. And we've experienced that here in Oklahoma already with the ICE raids that Trump was putting forward in Minnesota and Operation Guardian here in Oklahoma. And we saw a lot of our tribal citizens being targeted and harassed by ICE, and having to see leadership from these different tribes tell their tribal citizens how to actually navigate these situations. And so this is all contributing to the system that enables these agencies to be able to centralize that data and be able to more effectively target and surveil and harass our community.
All right, Ashley, thank you for kicking off our conversation today. I want to bring Jordan Harmon in now because, Jordan, last year the Muscogee Nation was approached by an outside company interested in building a data center on tribal land there. How did you find out about this?
Hi. Yeah, I found out about the data center that was proposed at Loop Square Ranch in the Muscogee Reservation here in Oklahoma because it popped up on the National Council's agenda. There was not, a lot of information out there. There wasn't like a press release. There wasn't any kind of statements to the public. It just popped up as a Muscogee tech hub. And some of my just friends and community members looked at the language of the bill where the tech hub was actually a hyperscale data center campus. And that started us off calling the sponsors of the resolution, asking, what is this about? Why are you doing this? Calling our other National Council representatives, asking if they support this and what it's really about, and then communicating with other departments like the Environmental Services Department about the implication for the land there and the importance of conserving it.
Interesting. We're going to talk a lot more about these data centers and what the implications are for tribal communities. Obviously, there are risks, there are challenges, and there are folks on the show today who are explaining what those risks and what those challenges represent. Of course, there are other tribes as well that see opportunities here with regard to data centers, and I'm interested in hearing from some listeners right now and getting your thoughts with regard to data centers. Maybe you live in a tribal community that is considering the option of building a data center, specifically maybe one of these hyperscale data centers we're talking about today. And maybe you have concerns. Maybe you feel very similar to our guest today that these data centers represent risks, they represent challenges, and they're not necessarily a good idea for your tribal community. Or maybe you feel otherwise. Either way, we always appreciate it when listeners join the conversation and they share their insights, share their perspectives, and they offer additional information and details that we can include on this show and we can share with our listeners on all of our stations who partner with us and broadcast our show live every day across Indian Country. And of course, those folks who also listen to us on streaming platforms as well. So again, that number, if you want to join the conversation today, is 1-800-996-2848. 1-800-996-2848. That connects you to our studio in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we have a little data center of our own at work to ensure that we're able to broadcast this show every day. So again, 1-800-99-NATIVE. More with Jordan Harmon and our other guests on the other side of this break. So stay with us, folks. We will be right back. Margaret Wilkins Pierce is making a name for herself in the world of cartography. She creates maps through a distinctly indigenous lens, using language, overlays, and historical references to portray a perspective maps don't typically show. Pierce has received a George Polk Award, a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and National Geographic's Wayfarer Award. And she is our Native in the Spotlight on the next Native America Calling.
Support from Davis Keelan Law Firm, a New Mexico firm standing with Native families suffering catastrophic loss. When tragedy strikes Indian country, Davis Keelan fights to restore stability, dignity, and justice, bringing a voice to Native families and communities for 20 years. More information, daviskeelan.com.
Hear that? Tribal college faculty do so much, one can't say it all here. Nothing but respect. Visit mostthoroughdjobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
You are listening to Native America Calling, and we're talking about data center projects in tribal communities today. Large tech companies are looking to tribes to house these large infrastructure facilities. Are community leaders in your area considering the opportunities and challenges of building a data center? Join this conversation. Give us a call. The number is 1-800-996-2848. Once again, 1-800-996-2848 to share your perspectives on the air. We have Jordan Harmon on the line right now in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She is with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And Jordan, earlier You gave us some more insights with regard to this company that was interested in building a data center there on tribal lands of the Muscogee Nation. And I'm interested in learning more about what were the initial red flags that you and others detected, and what exactly was this company offering? What was in it for the tribe to potentially partner with them?
Yeah, so the company that approached the nation was Switch Inc. And they're a large company, but they're not as big as Google, Microsoft, XAI. And they are a data center company that promises 100% renewable energy, but most of their data centers are powered with nuclear energy, which is not really a renewable resource that has to be mined, it has to be processed. There's a lot of environmental impacts. There's a lot of toxic waste involved. And so that was the company. There was never, as far as we know, an actual contract with the company. They were just there presenting to the National Council about developing the ranch, which the land in question was, or is, Loop Square Ranch, which was a historic property acquisition for the Muscogee Nation. In 2021, there was a large historic ranch called the Dillingham Ranch that was owned by colonizer descendants. It was about 12,000 acres, and they split it up, and the nation purchased about half of that. So almost 6,000, over 5,000 acres, and went through what for us was a historic land into trust application. The tribe, the real estate office, the environmental office, all of these departments worked really hard to put this almost 6,000 acres into trust. And then it was presented to the tribal citizens as a food sovereignty initiative. They were going to, they hired an ag director to oversee it, and he's done a great job. And it was going to be this ranching project. They were going to raise cattle the right way. They were going to introduce native grasses. They were going to protect pollinators. They built the Muscogee meat processing plant, the Loop Square processing plant, adjacent to the ranch. So it was kind of like this little food sovereignty system. So when the resolution was put on the agenda and we found out that Switch Inc. was proposing a multi-phase plan to develop the entire up to 5,000 acres, that came as a pretty big shock for it to just kind of like casually show up like that, and wondering, what would happen there. We learned more about the land, like that the nation had received a couple $1 million grant to plug up the leaking wells on the site. So Oklahoma, we have a lot of old and abandoned wells that are leaking methane gas and like leaking other things. So the nation was undertaking a big environmental cleanup project on that land. There was concern, so like that would somehow be interrupted. And just, we had a lot of questions. As far as we know, there was never a contract with Switch Inc., but they were the company approaching the tribe. And then when we asked the sponsors of the resolution, they kind of made it sound like it wasn't set in stone. It was no big deal. We're just going to rezone. We're just going to rezone this agriculture land for development. It's no big deal. Nothing's set in stone. But when you looked at the resolution, the very first sentence, and they said it's not about data centers. Well, the entire text of the resolution was about data centers. The very first sentence said, the Creek Nation sees the need for the development of data centers. So that was the first red flag. And the fact that they wanted to potentially develop the entire ranch was like the second big red flag.
Okay. So ultimately the tribe voted against rezoning this land that you're describing to us today. How did the vote come out? Was it a landslide, or were there some folks that were supportive of the idea?
It was a landslide. There were 4 votes for and 12 votes against. And this was a huge effort on the part of the citizens contacting national representatives. And we were hearing from national council members that they were getting, as many calls as they've ever gotten about anything in regard to this. And going into the vote, some of the council members were kind of reluctant to share beforehand what their vote was going to be. So we really did not know we really did not have any idea if this was going to be defeated or not. And then it ended up, yes, 12-4, it was defeated.
Okay. Now, what's interesting also in this issue today is that Oklahoma is already home to a fair number of large hyperscale data centers. What is it about Oklahoma? And we heard a little bit earlier from Ashley talking about tribal lands and sovereignty and things like that that make our lands attractive to some of these companies. But what more specifically about Oklahoma is making it a hotspot for so many tech companies right now looking to build these data centers?
Yeah, there's a multitude of reasons for that. And really, the data center boom in Oklahoma is relatively new, although we've had them, like the Google data center in Pryor was one of Google's first data centers of that scale. And it was first developed in 2006. So that has been there for that long, and now they want to expand it. It's also based on Google's own environmental reports, the top water user of all of their data centers. So it uses the most water than any of their other ones, and that includes the bigger ones too. And one of the reasons Ashley touched on is we have a lot of rural land. We have two major city metropolitan areas, and then the rest of the state is very rural. There's a lot of agriculture land, which there's plenty of environmental impacts and shortcomings of the agriculture industry. However, it's very different than the data center industry in the sense that we definitely need food to survive. And there's not a lot of environmental protection. So it's a very friendly state for businesses. There's a lot of tax incentives. There's not a lot of tax, accountability for big companies like that. And then we have a governor who he's very anti-tribal. He's, not considered, he's kind of considered the enemy of tribal sovereignty here. He's tried to overturn the McGirt case multiple times, and he's really jumped on the bandwagon of the current presidential administration, sort of energy development, AI development, and tech development, and he wants to cash in on that. So he's trying to make a state that's friendly for these data centers. And then we do have water. I mean, our state has water strain. Our aquifers are absolutely in danger, but the tech industry would like to paint it as a water-rich area. And if we could just divert that to the data centers, we could make a bunch of money. These are false promises that they're making.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. 1-800-99-NATIVE. That is the number if you would like to join our conversation today, talking about data centers potentially coming to tribal lands. Again, 1-800-99-NATIVE. You can be the person next to share your insights on the air. 1-800-99-NATIVE. Let's bring Cheyenne McNeil into our conversation now. She's an editorial fellow at Mother Jones. And earlier this month, she published an article. It's titled, "In Indian Country, Data Centers Come with a Familiar Threat of Colonialism." These organizers are fighting back, and she profiles what we're hearing from Jordan with regard to what has recently taken place there on the Muscogee Nation. But Cheyenne, I want to also ask you about federal resources that are available to tribes for energy and technology projects like data centers, because your reporting mentioned them. Can you provide more details?
Yeah. So the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs under the Department of Energy has been hosting these webinars, sort of telling tribal leaders how they can get into the data center game. And they do make the distinction. There are all these different kinds of data centers. But it's just on this government website. They kind of have this overview of what tribes can do to get involved. And they kind of, to me, they're kind of playing down some of what a data center is. So it's oh, this is just a room with a bunch of computers. And we know that not every data center is going to be quite that small, like the one you described earlier. So they're offering help getting the infrastructure in place. Just kind of if you do this, we can help you this way. But it kind of sounds like I've attended some of the webinars, and they're just, we know it's not for everyone, but this is what it could mean, if that makes sense.
It does make sense because there are tribal leaders and other Native people who do see data centers as economic development. What have you learned through your reporting in terms of the potential benefits that a data center could offer a tribal community? And any examples of tribal nations right now that are getting on this boom right now with regard to the tech industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one I'm still trying to track down a bit. So a lot of experts and like research I've read are saying these data centers are pretty much going to be bad for the local communities that surround them. There aren't a lot of benefits that, in this case, tribal communities would actually have. It's also, we're hearing a lot of, well, this is going to bring jobs, and that's exciting to any community, I think, especially today. But realistically, the jobs might be construction jobs for a year or two while a data center is being built, and then data centers usually employ just a couple of dozen people, and they're they tend to be specialized jobs that likely wouldn't tap into an already existing workforce. And so some of these benefits that we're hearing and that are being sold aren't actually going to be like long lasting like tribal communities or rural communities might hope. As far as tribal communities that might already be in the game, I'm not aware of one that has a hyperscale data center. That doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. And maybe Jordan or Ash might be able to answer that better.
Okay. Ashley, how about you? Any tribes that you're familiar with right now that are either operating a hyperscale data center or are on their way to doing so in the relatively near future?
Complicated, but yeah, Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma, they've approved and they are moving forward with Project Clydesdale, which is a hyperscale data center. But they also just recently instituted a task force to investigate the environmental and economic impacts of data centers. And so there is still hope. But yeah, just locally here, that's one that I can name right off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. We actually have some audio of Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. announcing the creation of a task force on data centers from last week. Let's take a listen now.
There is unquestionably benefits to the Cherokee Nation in using AI, using technology. I mean, it was 2 years ago that we signed an executive order to study the use of technology to assert a sovereignty over our data. That moved into a task force report, which resulted in a policy that so that we could ethically and responsibly use artificial intelligence in our government operations to make them more efficient, more effective, all in the service of the Cherokee people, all in delivering programs and services to the Cherokee people. Those are all things that we have to stay on the leading edge of in terms of understanding what technologies are available. What this executive order says is that none of that happens in isolation. None of that is consequence-free in terms of the world around us. None of that is free of positive and negative impacts economically and impacts on our environment. And that we have a responsibility as the Cherokee Nation to try to assert as much control over the world around us as we can in the service of the Cherokee people. That means understanding issues that are very complicated. We do not have and will not have all of the solutions. We do not have and will not have all of the authority to make changes or to protect everything we want to protect or to leverage the economic benefits that may be attending artificial intelligence and data centers. But I know this, if we are reactionary to the world around us, we will be sidelined. If we choose to do nothing and put our heads in the sand, we will be sidelined, and our nation is not going to be sidelined on any issue, particularly one as consequential in this century as artificial intelligence and data centers. We are going to be part of the conversation, part of the solution, part of guiding policy in the future so that we can all live in a world that's as balanced as possible.
Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. urging for tribes not to be sidelined in this current wave of the tech revolution that we are all living through right now with regard to data centers and artificial intelligence. And Ashley, we've got about a minute and a half before we have to take our next break. And just listening to the conversation today, hearing Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr., I mean, it just seems like there's just a lot we still don't really understand about these data centers. It seems like a really immense learning curve to really get folks to understand all of the risks, all of the opportunities, just exactly how these facilities could potentially function. At Honor the Earth, how do you folks go about doing that work, educating people so they have all of the information and all the facts to make right decisions?
Yeah, so we definitely spend a lot of time researching and providing fact sheets and resources and even questions that tribal leaders and communities can ask the developers to learn more themselves. And so we really want the communities to be self-sufficient. But I think, just one thing I'd like to point to with Chief Hoskin, just underscoring the need for our tribal nations to institute these moratoriums so that we can know what the impacts actually are. We don't have to say yes. As tribal nations with sovereignty and in this moment of termination era policy, we really should be reinforcing our sovereignty. And one really concrete way to do that is to say no, or at least to say we're going to wait to see how this actually will benefit our communities and what the harm actually is. And so that's one of the things that we've been pushing with the tribal nations and with these different municipalities is, a moratorium. Sit back. You don't have to say yes right away. We don't have to be sacrifice zones. We can actually see how this is going to harm our communities and what the benefits actually are.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. We're going to take another short break and we will come back and we'll continue our conversation and we'll bring Dr. Karen Jarrett-Snyder into the dialogue. She is a professor of applied indigenous studies at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. And of course, the phone lines are open for folks who would like to join our hyperscale data center conversation today. Let us know challenges, opportunities. What are your thoughts? 1-800-99-NATIVE.
Support by the Gathering of Nations Powwow. The last dance is this April 24th and 25th at Expo, New Mexico. Gone's last horse rider and regalia parade takes place at 4 p.m. both days. Tickets at gatheringofnations.com and at the gates.
Kaufman & Associates is a Native-owned and led consulting firm, supporting Native communities with culturally grounded solutions to shape Indigenous futures. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce, and let's continue now with our discussion about how construction of hyperscale data centers could impact local economies, communities, and land. Still plenty of time to join us. 1-800-996-2848. That is the number to share your thoughts on the air. Again, 1-800-99-NATIVE. And I also want to let our listeners know that we did reach out to two entities that support data centers in Indian country, Colusa Indian Energy and the Native American Mining and Energy Sovereignty Initiative at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at Colorado School of Mines. And we didn't hear back from them in time for this show. So at any rate, that is a disclaimer so you folks know that we have looked at the other side of the issue as well. We're going to bring Dr. Karen Jarrett-Snyder into our conversation in just a moment. But first, we have a caller on the line. This is Theodora, who is listening up in North Dakota on radio station KMHA. Hello, Theodora. It's been a while since you've called in. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for taking my call. And I'm calling today about... you were talking about the data centers. A couple of weeks ago, I just heard that the Tribal Council took action on a data center in July of 2025, which was about 10 months ago. And I'm alarmed about what I'm hearing of the data centers. There's a lot of controversy in several counties in North Dakota now because of proposed data centers in their counties. In Williston, North Dakota, they had supposed to have the biggest data center in the U.S. when it was first built, and they recently had to settle with the neighbors who lived near that data center. From what I could find out, there was a letter of intent improved in a closed session of the tribal council meeting, so tribal members couldn't hear the discussion about the data center. The local tribal radio station and the tribal newspapers can only print what they are given, so there's not any info out about this tribal council plan. I just recently saw the resolution pertaining to the data center, and the tribal council left it up to the chairman to decide on the details of it, I guess.
Okay.
So,
Theodora?
we're having a tribal council election this year, so maybe more information on this might get out.
Okay. Theodore, thank you so much for calling. This is really helpful information. And just to clarify for our listeners who might not be familiar with your part of the country up there, you're referring to the 3 affiliated tribes up there on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, correct?
Yes, this is on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Mm-hmm. Our tribe is the 3 affiliated tribes, or it's also called the MHA Nation.
Right, yeah. Been up there a few times, yeah. Theodore, thank you for calling in. And again, there's a perspective of a tribal community that is interested in data centers. And we heard Theodora in terms of her concerns and what her hesitations are with regard to how this is moving forward. So really appreciate that call. And someone else who would like to join us, the phone lines are still open, 1-800-996-2848. Let's now hear from Dr. Karen Jarrett-Snyder, Professor of Applied Indigenous Studies at Northern Arizona University. And Karen, I want to thank you because you've been waiting patiently, listening to our conversation. And I want to ask you, are data center issues like the ones we heard Jordan and Ashley discuss earlier, are they similar to what you see in the Southwest where you're located?
Well, again, good morning. And yes, to some extent. It's really impossible to generalize around data center issues, around energy use and water use for data centers, because there are so many variables. Depends on the type of data center, depends on where the climate around where they're trying to locate it. For example, a data center located in a typically very warm climate, such as, for example, Phoenix, Arizona, has different challenges and implications for water use, as well as the type of cooling system that they're using. Are they trying to air cool it, water cool it? Is it evaporative water cooling? But the conversation is a buzz, and the conversation is moving fast because this issue in general about data centers is moving fast. We need more and more energy for generative AI because so many more things in our daily lives rely on the use of generative AI.
Karen, I read in one of the articles researching this show that some of these hyperscale data centers, they can use as much as 5 million gallons of water a day. And we've covered the water issues, the lack of water in many parts of the Southwest. We've talked about that a lot on Native America Calling. Tribes in the Southwest, I mean, do they have access to anywhere near that amount of water for possible hyperscale data centers?
Well, it depends on the nation and what their water rights are, what their winter rights are. And it's not just on the nation, but there are up and downstream effects. So someone could locate a data center not necessarily on indigenous lands, but affecting indigenous lands. And water doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries, right? So you can put a data center in some place, and that may be, we'll call it a water hog for now, that may use a great deal of water, be one of those that uses up to 5 million gallons a day, or maybe it's only using 1 million gallons per day. And even if it's not on tribal lands and not coming out of their water allocations, there's only so much water to go around. And right now, southwestern states and communities are already looking at shortages for the Colorado River water because of we've had several winters where we just haven't had the precipitation that approaches normal levels.
There's also the power issue, of course, because these centers require enormous amounts of power, and you have local power grids that just might not be able to support that type of consumption. Does that mean that at some point data center projects include some kind of power generation as well?
Absolutely. And what type of power generation is the question. So there's geothermal, there's nuclear, fossil fuel generation, and renewables. Are any one of those sources going to be able to provide the amount of power that we're going to need? It just depends. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory produced a report in late 2024 that talked about, in particular, how much power. And again, we don't know exactly. It depends on the data center and load demands and forecasting. As the Arizona Energy Promise Task Force for the Arizona Governor's Office just pointed out, accurately forecasting large load is difficult. The timelines shift, what they're doing, how much they're going to process at any one data center is a question mark, right? And it's a question that we don't often have answers for. But when Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory found out that by 2030, it's possible that data centers, large-scale data centers that we're talking about for generative AI, could use the amount of energy that would equate 22,000 households annually. That's a lot of energy.
It certainly is. Earlier, we had one of the other guests mention nuclear power, and I'd like you to expand on that, Karen, because they have these innovation campuses right now, and these are all part of a push, right, through the Department of Energy to provide more opportunities with regard to this type of energy. Tell us more about these innovation campuses and what your thoughts are on these.
Well, on January 28th of this year, the Department of Energy issued a request for information to states, not indigenous nations, but states, for those interested in submitting an application for a nuclear fuel cycle innovation campus. So what is that? Well, it's pretty much just what it sounds like. It covers the entire nuclear fuel cycle. So it could have to do with producing the energy, enriching the energy, providing the generation of nuclear power, and reprocessing or recycling used nuclear or spent nuclear fuel. And it could also include an AI data center. Currently, the country does not have a deep geologic repository. So what do we do with our nuclear waste? Well, it's called interim storage, which can be, interim can mean up to 125 years, and there have been quite a few advances in nuclear waste storage, but we're talking about above ground secure storage of nuclear waste. The reprocessing and recycling of spent nuclear fuel, that sounds promising, right? And there have been some advances there lately. But the Innovation Campus is about containing, having everything that is needed for the entire nuclear fuel life cycle, as the title suggests.
Okay. And as it stands now, the federal government has been focused primarily on states, and tribal governments have not been included in most of these efforts. Is that right? Am I correct on that?
They weren't included in the initial RFI. That was sent out to states. I did hear recently that the DOE said, well, indigenous nations can apply if they want to. And these applications they're looking at, the federal government is looking at public-private partnerships for these innovation campuses. But the initial push was for states only.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Karen. Ashley Litka, I want to go back to you. And this is kind of an interesting side topic that has my interest a lot right now. SpaceX, of course, Elon Musk's startup, is proposing massive orbital data centers, potentially comprised of about 1 million satellites up in space. And that's that vision in terms of how to handle these enormous AI computing demands by leveraging space-based solar power and radiative cooling. And I don't understand the technology behind it at all. But what are your thoughts with regard to that orbital data centers, and what could that potentially mean with regard to tribal nations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think, just touching on what the last, panelist was talking about, some of the technologies that these companies are trying to say that they're able to accomplish, such as the closed loop system, or conversations around being water positive by the year 2030. What we're seeing is that a lot of the technology and a lot of the things that these companies are talking about are actually very hypothetical. And I think that this development is also hypothetical. And I think that we really need to bring these conversations back down to real time and what we actually have available to us and what has actually already happened. And we know, for example, with nuclear, that our Navajo Dene relatives, they've been fighting these fights for decades now with the hauling, the transporting, the storage of uranium that is required for nuclear. And so really what we're seeing is that there's a lot of hypotheticals that are being waved before our communities, waved before our tribal leaders who don't fully understand that this isn't realized technology. And that's causing a lot of harm by going ahead and moving forward and letting our communities be that sandbox, letting our communities be the ones that are tested on, because these technologies have not been realized. They're all hypothetical, just like Elon Musk and SpaceX.
Okay. But what's not hypothetical is what we're talking about right now with some of these tribes who have been approached by some of these companies with regard to hyperscale data centers. And Ashley, one more question before we have to wrap up, because I always want these shows to be informative and educational for our listeners. And for somebody listening right now who has more questions and is just kind of beginning to think more about the implications of large data centers on tribal lands, where's the best place they can go to learn more and educate themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the community, coming together with the community, and a lot of the problems that we're seeing with these developments are those non-disclosure agreements. And that's what, your caller was mentioning earlier, is that, this is manufacturing consent in our communities. And that's a huge problem. And that's where a lot of the breakdown and a lot of the tension comes from. But, I think just really sitting back, of course, Honor the Earth, we have a whole repository of resources, and we've created a national Indigenous coalition called Stop Data Colonialism, and that space is ran by Indigenous people all over Turtle Island who are dealing with hyperscale data center projects on their own lands. And so there's a lot of regional and national information coming out from those spaces. But I definitely encourage people to visit Honor the Earth, our website. We have a toolkit. We have a lot of vetted resources. We have a lot of information around the different flashy things that the companies are coming forward after we've battled down the myth that there's such a thing as the closed loop system. Now they're coming forward with this idea about being water positive, and so we have information about how to combat those sort of narratives, as well as questions that people can ask themselves so that they can get the answers. And then we always encourage people to bring that information back to their local communities. That's where the power is with the people. That's how we're able to stop the data center in Muscogee Creek. That's how we're able to stop the data center at Seminole Nation, is by the community coming together, informing each other, sharing information, and bringing that information to their leadership. And so, yeah, definitely encouraging that.
And with that, we are out of time. We're going to have to wrap up this conversation today. But first, I do want to thank all of our guests, Ashley Litka, Jordan Harmon, Cheyenne McNeil, and Dr. Karen Jarrett Snyder. Please don't forget to join us again tomorrow for a conversation with our April Native in the Spotlight, cartographer Margaret Wickens Pierce. She was named a National Geographic 33. I'm Sean Spruce. We'll talk again soon.
Hear that? That's everything tribal college faculty do for their students on Fast Forward. Because if one tried to say it in real time, they'd be here all day. They teach, guide, comfort, and connect. And for that, the community is grateful. Learn more at mostthoroughdjobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
They give extensions, cheer progress, share laughter, create calm, and allow reflection. They inspire hope, share wisdom, guide gently, validate healing.
Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.